I endured years of humiliation as the backbone of the family, but the day my husband slammed the door and handed me an eviction notice, they stabbed me in the back by thinking I had nothing left to protect. I watched him smile as if he had finally won. I held a secret they couldn't imagine. I had been the quiet guardian of our family legacy, deeds I inherited from my grandmother, an irrevocable trust set up in my name, and accounts that covered the same lifestyle they demanded from me. I didn't explode then. I let the truth simmer until it was time to serve justice. My name is Maya Brooks, and I am 42 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I walked away with everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the years I spent smiling and saying, "I'll handle it." I remember the way Marvin would lean back in the recliner and make that tiny exhale of relief, like my forgiveness was oxygen he could depend on forever. He liked me tidy, efficient, grateful, attributes that fit the role he wanted. I learned very young how to turn my rage into prayer. My grandmother used to say, "Child, hold your peace like treasure. It will tell you more than noise ever could." So I became peace. Every morning I woke before the sun. I packed lunches, straightened cufflinks, ran through schedules with our children, Desmond, now 21 and trying to find himself, Nia, 25 and fiercely bright, and Simone, 16, who still hugged my neck the way she did when she was 5. I balanced medical forms and mortgage statements, set reminders for Marvin's important client dinners, and texted my mother-in-law, Yvonne, about the caterer for the family reunion even when she never once said thank you. They called me practical. They called me resilient. My sister Tasha would wink and say, "Girl, you are the rock," which felt half like flattery and half like a sentence. The rock doesn't get to complain. The rock doesn't keep receipts or ask questions. The rock is assumed to be limitless. I had reasons for the mask. I was raised to keep the family seat intact, to hold the threads together, to make sure the house that kept us was kept. But I wasn't only a fixer. Under the quiet, I was assembling, piece by piece, a safety net. I ran a small investment portfolio under a trust my grandmother had whispered to me about as a girl, an if I'm gone kind of thing. I learned to funnel receipts through an LLC, to sign as MB Brooks on certain accounts, to quietly save when Marvin insisted on our money being for us. I did this not because I wanted power to lord over anyone, but because the stories from my mother and grandmother carved into me the law of self-preservation. Expect betrayal and be ready for it. Yvonne would parade around in borrowed pearls and comment on my outfits as if my thrift store cardigan was evidence of my place. "Maya, you can't wear that to the board meeting," she'd say, touching my sleeve with an air of disgust that felt like a physical push. Marvin would joke that I was domestic, in the tone reserved for pets. Invitations to fundraisers came to him. I would show up and be the woman who managed everything while others thanked him for his vision. The credit never landed on my shoulders. Yet whenever money or kindness was needed, they flung their hands at me like I was an ATM that never saw fraud. At night, when the house finally quieted and the kids were asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table with receipts like small confessions. I would sign forms with a calm hand, transfer of title, revocable trust updates, a discreet property insurance policy under an LLC named Brookfield Holdings. A name that would mean little to Marvin, but everything to me. I didn't tell him because I wanted to test him. I didn't tell anyone because I was learning who would love me if there was something to love and who would follow the money. That pretense let them take liberties. Marvin took my patience for weakness. Yvonne took my courtesy for inferiority. My sister, once close, now envied the social ladder Marvin had the audacity to climb on my back. My friend Jamal, a banker who loved me like a quiet brother, could see the strain. He'd knock on my window late at night with coffee and say, "Maya, you deserve to be treated like what you build." I nodded and made him promise he would never, ever let me make an impulsive court filing without counsel. I was faithful, not foolish. I gave them the illusion of safety while I bought mine. Greed smells like perfume and desperation. It is loud in the worst ways. The way Marvin laughed after a bad joke, the way Yvonne's voice rose at church when someone else received praise. People in debt make demands like gods. You can feel the audacity of entitlement when someone insists the world owes them style. It started small. A loan, Marvin called it, to pay for an investment that would flip their lifestyle. I wrote checks for things I didn't want to know about. Jaded furniture deliveries arrived with tags that read, "To Yvonne," as if she had actually purchased what she took for granted. Nia told me she needed a car for a new job. Marvin suggested we sell the ancestral cottage out by the river. "Nobody uses that place anymore," he said, as if the memories were garbage. What I didn't know then was that being kind had taught them a lesson I never intended. Silence equals assent. The more I settled the bills, the more they demanded. And then one afternoon, during a family dinner after a funeral, I overheard the plan. They didn't think I could hear them. Marvin and Yvonne were leaning over the mashed potatoes, whispering like schoolchildren about making a clean break and bringing in someone fresh. They spoke in code: the house and the property and the savings. Marvin's voice was velvet. Yvonne's was a serrated laugh that scraped my skin. "We can't keep feeding her," Yvonne said. "She's become a charity case. We do not owe her an estate." "She'll sign," Marvin smirked. "She'll want peace. She always signs." They drew a roadmap. Move the younger woman in, pressure me to release the river cottage deed, divorce me quietly, freeze my access to bank accounts by claiming a handling arrangement. They had already planned to file for temporary custody if I made any fuss. They had checked their options with a slick attorney Marvin knew at the country club. I listened with a quiet that felt like ice settling in my chest. What they didn't know, because no one ever thinks the quiet woman is counting, is that I had a copy of every bill, every mortgage statement, and a long, annotated timeline of every expense they thought was its due. I had audited the family business's books in the privacy of the nights when the rest of the house slept. For months, I had been learning how the money moved, who pocketed what, where the credit lines were exhausted, and which accounts were vulnerable. There was a small, pretty thrill when the pattern revealed itself. They were all overdrawn. They lived lavishly on borrowed promises. That evening, when Marvin returned to his study, pockets full of entitlement, I went to my room and took out the trust binder. I turned the pages deliberately. Deeds stamped with my grandmother's hand. A private trust, properly funded. An LLC that controlled the title to the river cottage. Copies of correspondence that showed attempts to secure loans in my name were already flagged. There were contingency clauses in place if I was ever forced to abandon residence, the way courts sometimes interpret abandonment in a messy divorce. The terms of the irrevocable trust would kick in and prevent a simple sale. My grandmother had taught me one last lesson that night. Make your agreements hard to break. How I found the strength to be still, I'll never fully explain. Maybe it was prayer. Maybe it was the memory of my mother sewing new life into old jackets, of my father teaching me how to read the law like a poem. But I chose a path of strategy. Rage would have been immediate and visible. And while there's a time for flame, this moment called for chess. I quietly called Kendra Price, my attorney, a woman who had once been my classmate and now carried a powerhouse reputation in estate law. "Do not act," she said over the phone when I explained the whispers. "Let them move. Let them make the attempt. Collect everything. Trust me." Her voice had that calm that belongs only to those who have put others under legal microscopes and found the truth. That was an order as holy as prayer. I built my quiet legal arsenal: audits on the family holdings, certified notices to agents who were attempting to list property, and a series of documents that would, when released, create the legal equivalent of a checkmate. I recorded conversations, not cruelly, but legally where possible, collected bank statements, and had Jamal, who still owed me a favor, retrieve records showing suspicious transfers from the LLC into personal accounts. I updated the deed language so that the river cottage was attached to a protective trust that required unanimous signature from the grantor, our Michi, to release. I prepared NDAs and eviction notices that would, when needed, do more than words. They thought taking from me would be seamless. They thought I had been worn down. What they failed to factor in was that I had never been broken. I had been buying time. I remember the day I set my trap like the setting of a chess piece on a wooden board. It was a Thursday. The kids had school. Marvin had a business dinner. Yvonne had a luncheon where she planned to parrot the words self-made like a mantra. I sat at the same kitchen table where I had once paid the plumber with a check that Marvin later used to purchase a watch, and I smiled quietly at the symmetry of it all. Kendra walked in at noon. She carried a leather folder and a presence that made the air tidy. Her assistant, a young man named Deshawn, stayed by the door with a calm that said he had seen worse and survived. We reviewed the documents like priests over a psalm. There were deed amendments signed years ago that I had never had cause to enforce. There was also a clause the family never suspected, a protective no transfer stipulation that activated under attempted coercion or fraud. "Remember," Kendra said, arranging the paperwork, "we're not seeking brute punishment. We're ensuring protection. Your grandmother's instrument will do the work, Maya. Let it." I let it. I set the stage by doing exactly what Marvin wanted. I pretended not to see the signs. I let him bring a woman, her name was Bianca, home the next week. She was young, glossy, and unaware that she had been handed someone else's mess wrapped in a designer scarf. She thought she was stepping into victory. She thought she was stepping into a home. What I did privately was send a certified letter to the realtor Marvin had contacted, inform the bank that any transfers from the business accounts would be subject to audit, and quietly place a temporary injunction on any attempted sale of the cottage. I also had Deshawn arrange for an independent review of the LLC accounts. The audit would reveal not just misused funds, but intentional misappropriation. A trap that's too obvious fails. So I built layers. First, the paperwork that prevented a sale legally. Second, a quietly scheduled family council I suggested during Sunday dinner, appealing to their vanity. "We should all be present when decisions about the old place are discussed," I had said, feigning the very thing they had accused me of lacking. Community. They loved the stage of family decisions, the imagined spectacle of public resolutions that made them look magnanimous. Marvin agreed, smiling. Yvonne planned her speech. Tasha, who had been flirty with the desire for social air, made plans to invite her friends. I let the theatrics blind them further. Bianca would come to the meeting too. She would be the emblem of why they needed a fresh start. But the real show would not be on stage. The real show would be in the documents I would release when they tried to make their first move. At 2 a.m., when the house was again in its deep blue hush, I uploaded copies of the trust language to a secure server and sent them to Kendra with a single instruction: release during the meeting, hold nothing back. I also prepared a press packet in case they chose to escalate. A clean, factual timeline of the misappropriations with evidence supplied by Jamal's quiet records. While I worked, I prayed. Not the practiced prayers that soothe public perception, but the raw kind that asks for strength and clarity. "Keep me humble," I whispered, "but make my justice precise." It felt like making a promise more than a plea. When Sunday came, the living room was crowded and glittering. Family photos lined the mantel like witnesses. Marvin was the picture of confidence. Yvonne had on an emerald dress that matched the color of her alertness. Bianca sat on the ottoman, bright-lipped and ready to be adored. I started the meeting with softness. "We are family," I said, my voice low and steady. And the river cottage belongs to all of us in memory, but the title is held in trust to protect family memory like Grandma wanted. I let my words be a balm. Then, like a surgeon, I started to remove the bandage. Kendra stood. Her voice is a precise instrument. "I have here a set of documents that were executed years ago," she said. "There are stipulations that make any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the river property subject to our grantor's express consent. And there has been a pattern of transfers from the LLC into personal accounts without proper authorization." I felt each face go from smug to small. Marvin's jaw trembled like a hinge. Yvonne's laugh cracked like a brittle shell. The air in the room became a thing you could slice with a letter opener. And then came the move I had saved for last. Kendra released the audit summary. It showed clear transfers, large sums moved in ways inconsistent with corporate governance, the receipts lined to the furniture, the trips, the loans taken out under false pretenses. There was even a recorded voicemail, one Marvin had left on a business line, that, when played, made his voice sound less like a leader and more like a man who panicked when the tide of money receded. "No," Bianca whispered. Her sympathy was gone as fast as it had formed. I could have raised my voice. I could have screamed for justice like the movies. Instead, I lifted my chin, let the evidence speak, and watched as the dignity they had assumed dissolved under the weight of paper. Kendra then handed them a stack of letters. Eviction notices for anyone occupying the river cottage without authorization, notices of freeze on any attempted sale, and a demand letter for the immediate return of misappropriated funds. I watched their faces as if I were seeing actors' red lines. Shame is a softening powder that does more to soften hearts than even kindness. I did not laugh. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as enjoying their pain. I wanted to be seen as the woman who had used the law as a shield and the truth as a sword. When Marvin tried to argue, Kendra's legal calm cut him down to sighs. "This is not about humiliation," she said. "This is about accountability. The instruments are clear." People in the room shifted. My children clung to one another, uncertain. Simone's eyes were wide and wet. Nia placed a hand on my arm like an anchor, and in that small human gesture I found a vindicating warmth I hadn't realized I needed. The perfect trap is one the opponent walks into willingly. They had chosen their arrogance. And that day, the crowd in the living room, friends, neighbors, even certain club acquaintances Marvin had invited to witness his win, became an audience to their unraveling. I remember each sentence I spoke like a polished stone I had put in my mouth to drop in a still pond. "I have been the steward of our family's memory," I said calmly. "I have upheld obligations many of you have never seen. If you think I am easy prey, then I am sorry you never bothered to learn me." Marvin attempted charm. Yvonne tried indignation. Tasha tried to cry crocodile tears and appeal to my sisterhood. But the documents kept arriving like winter rain. Bank freezes, enforcement notices, recorded evidence, and the irrevocable trust clause that forced the property to remain in preservation unless I'm alive and consenting. The room's volume decreased like a recording slowing down. I watched their expressions move from defiance to disbelief to pleading. "Please, Maya," Marvin said at last, voice raw. "You don't have to do this." "But I do," I replied. The words tasted neutral. "Your greed is not my responsibility." At that point, Nia, who had always been the quiet one with a public defender's anger, stood and said something that made the room lurch like a ship hitting a reef. "You taught me to read contracts," she told Marvin, looking him straight in the face. "And you taught me not to be afraid of the paperwork at the bottom of the page. We have receipts, too." Someone in the crowd, a neighbor who had been suspicious of Marvin's sudden lifestyle change, pulled out a phone and started recording. That clip would travel in ways I didn't need to orchestrate. The humiliation they felt was private, not performative. I felt no glee, only an enormous settled release. Vengeance is a cheap thrill. Justice is a slow, deep exhale. I handed Bianca a card with Kendra's number and a sentence I had chosen with care. "You deserve better than a bed built on another woman's loss." I spoke without malice. I offered her a path off the stage. She took it, eyes wide and aching with confusion. There was a human cost here that made my triumph taste complex. But the cost of their actions had been mostly mine for years. I simply returned what was theirs to me. Marvin's friends left one by one. Yvonne tried to call in favors to lawyers she thought she knew, but the documents were filed with certified stamps and affidavits that made backtracking messy and public. The bank issued an immediate hold on suspicious transfers. The estate remained under protection. Paint ultimately refused to cover everything. I sat very still while Kendra filed an official complaint for embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. It was not personal theater. It was a legal punctuation mark. Each paper she slid across the coffee table felt like a nail in a door left open too long. The last move, a final, quiet flourish, was when I signed a new stewardship document and read it aloud. "From this day forward," I said, "I will be the only authorized agent for any transfer of the family estate. The trust will maintain the property for the education and well-being of future descendants." My voice trembled at one moment, then steadied. This is not vengeance. This is preservation. They had expected drama, muffled whispers, the kind of angry scenes that feed tabloids. Instead, they received cool, immovable law. The spreadsheet of our lives had been leveled, the tables turned. I left that meeting with my back straight and my hands empty of trophies. I took from that room only the right to sleep at night. The days that followed were a study in contrition and Craigslist apologies. Marvin wrote letters, some sincere, some performative, asking for forgiveness. Yvonne sent baskets of fruit and pamphlets about the church's mercies. Tasha called, tears on the line, asking me to reconsider. "Maya, baby, please," she said. I didn't know how deep it was. The way people apologize after being exposed is often an appeal to your better nature, and sometimes, if you are generous, you should respond with compassion. But there is a difference between compassion and surrender. I spent a week teaching my children about dignity. "We don't need to be defined by what people do to us," I told them, preparing us for the inevitable communal gossip. "We are defined by how we respond when we are hurt." Nia looked at me like she had inherited both my brains and my stubbornness. Desmond found steady work and moved into a small apartment of his own. Simone began to draw again, a gift she had put aside because the house had been too noisy with wants. Marvin tried to salvage his image at the country club. He lost a sponsor. People who had once congratulated him quietly untied themselves from his orbit. Yvonne moved into a smaller apartment, carrying boxes with hands that shook. Not because I wanted to see them diminished, but because actions have consequences. People ask me if I feel empty after such events, or guilty for turning the law on my family. There are moments where a thin grief arrives. Grief for the simpler illusions we once held, for the image of family as a safe harbor. But mostly there is relief. There is a peace that comes when you stop bending to be small for others' comfort. I began to travel. I took Simone and Nia to a small retreat in the Carolina mountains, a place my grandmother used to take me. We sat in circles and talked about boundaries like they were holy things, not negotiable favors. I hired Kendra to set up ongoing financial oversight that would prevent any future predation. I made friends with women who ran businesses and farms, women whose hands had known both calluses and worship. Jamal became my quiet confidant, a man who had always known. He came with me to the closing of a small property my grandmother had left me, a little house I turned into a scholarship fund for girls in the neighborhood who needed a push. I forgave, not because they asked for or deserved it, but because it was the only thing that kept me gentle in the world. Forgiveness did not mean re-inviting them to dinner. Forgiveness meant I no longer carried the rage like a guest in my body. I locked the door on the cottage and kept the key in a place that felt ceremonial, like a small shrine to who I had become. Someone who protected what mattered. People sent messages from all over after the meeting. Women over 40, like many of you watching, wrote that my story gave them courage to look at their own ledgers and secrets. They thanked me for the quiet courage to build safeguards, for showing them that elegance and justice need not be opposites. I answered each message with honesty. Start early, keep records, love yourself enough to sign the papers. Occasionally, when the family news feeds roll through, I see Marvin's face looking smaller in photographs, his smile thinner. He calls sometimes. I do not pick up. I read his messages, and sometimes they make me ache. When that ache comes, I go to the river cottage, walk the path by the water, and remember the hands of my grandmother as she braided hair under the willow tree. Her voice returns like a blessing. You held your peace, child. Now hold your life. If there is a moral to this story, it is not that revenge is sweet. It is that protection is sacred. It is possible to be both gentle and strategic. You do not have to shout to be heard. You do not have to expose your wounds to heal. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is plan, quietly, within the rules, until the day arrives when the world has to acknowledge the truth. I did not go looking to ruin them. I went looking to keep what was mine and to keep my children's future safe. I exited that house without thrown plates or dramatic confrontations. I closed the door on the life that had taken more than it gave. I drove away with my own savings intact, with a small fleet of documents that ensured no one could strip us bare again. Years from now, when grandchildren ask me how the family was saved, I will tell them about the late nights with receipts and the lawyers who were friends and the way prayer kept me patient. I will tell them that being the backbone does not mean carrying everyone at the cost of your own bones. And I will tell them to hold their peace like treasure, but to also hold their legal documents like shields. This story is for the women who have been made invisible by expectation. It is for the daughters who feel the weight of strong around their shoulders, like an armor that never bends. It is for the friends who texted me in the middle of the night to ask if they should hold on. Let me say it plainly. Preserve, plan, protect. Do it with elegance. And when the moment comes, do it with absolute, unshakable grace. Thank you for listening. If you are watching, tell me where you are from. If this story reminds you of someone you were or someone you wish to become, write it in the comments. We keep one another safe not by keeping quiet, but by sharing the maps we drew when the lights were low. I drove away and didn't look back. The river rippled like a silver promise. The house remained. The trust stood. My name printed on the deed, small dignified letters that held 1,000 memories, felt like a signature on my survival.